Picture yourself alone late at night, enjoying a novel by the light of a candle. The children have retired several hours before, and you are simply relishing the silence. Then it begins. Quiet at first and far away, but definitely there. A slow, methodical rapping noise. At first, it seems so distant your mind dismisses it as nothing. But it gradually grows in intensity, and its point of origin becomes clear. This sound, as though someone were banging on wood with a hammer, is coming from inside your home. In a house on Elmwood Avenue in Traverse City, Mrs. Fred Vaughn first heard these strange noises on a Friday night in the spring of 1902. Mr. Vaughn had just departed to his brother's farm in Leelanau County to assist in spring planting, and was not expected back until the following Sunday. When the sounds became so intense that Mrs. Vaughn began to fear a burglar, she raced to her children's bedrooms on the second floor of the house. Finding the children still asleep, she returned to a short stairwell which led to an attic door. By now, the sounds were clearly someone or something banging on the door itself. Bravely, Mrs. Vaughn began to climb the stairs. Just before reaching the door, the sounds stopped. By now, Mrs. Vaughn was nearly in a state of panic, but decided to remain in the house. The next day, she called for her husband to return from the fields, and together they checked the attic for signs of an intruder. They found nothing. The following weekend, Mr. Vaughn again left at sunset, and again the sounds began near midnight. And again, just as Mrs. Vaughn began to climb the stairs to the attic, they stopped. In fact, this scene was to be repeated every Friday night for 3 months. Mr. Vaughn also heard the sounds, as did several neighbors and friends who were invited on occasion. The Vaughns often joked about their timid ghost. The man who built the house attributed the sounds to a settling of the relatively new structure. But even he couldn't explain why the sounds stopped each time someone approached the attic door. Then came the fateful night in the autumn of 1902. Mr. Vaughn had again departed to his brother's farm to assist with the fall harvest. Just past 2 a.m., a horse-drawn wagon roared into the driveway of the farm. Inside were a quite hysterical Mrs. Vaughn and her children. It seems the sounds had started as usual around midnight. By now, they were more nuisance than novelty, and Mrs. Vaughn angrily approached the stairs and shouted, "I wish you would just stop this." The sound stopped, and the door opened. Whatever Mrs. Vaughn saw, she could never bring herself to speak of it. But neither she, the children, or Mr. Vaughn ever returned to the house. The house on Elmwood Avenue still stands. Since 1902, no resident has reported anything unusual. The current residents have requested that the address be kept secret. They also say the attic is nailed shut. The Haunting. A number of years ago, a man and his wife rented a small 2-story home in Braun. They had been searching for quite some time for suitable housing, and when they ran across this small but clean place and discovered the rent was only $150 a month, they snapped it up quickly. The day they moved in, the couple noticed that the door to one of the upstairs rooms had several locks installed on the outside. They were all locked, and because 2 of them required keys, the room could not be entered. They asked the landlord about this strange room and were told that a previous tenant had kept a mean dog inside.
He stated that he had accidentally locked the room a year before, but saw no real need to break in, as the room was empty and too small to be of any real use anyway. Satisfied with this answer, the couple ignored the door for several weeks. Eventually, however, curiosity got the best of them, and on a Saturday morning, they unscrewed the hinges and removed the door. The room inside was indeed very small and very dark. Its only occupant was a small bookcase filled with old books. As an avid reader, the husband marveled at the collection of antique volumes. He selected one titled The Walk of the Red Witch and took it with him to read. Each night he would read a chapter in the book, then place it on a table at their bedside. Each morning, the book would be gone. It would invariably turn up back on the bookshelf in the dark room upstairs. The couple found this repeated event rather disturbing, but also intriguing. So one night they decided to pretend to be asleep, but keep watch and determine how the book was making this journey up the stairs by itself. In the middle of that night, they both were startled when an old upright piano in the living room suddenly began to play. Staring at each other with wide eyes in the dim illumination of the nightlight, they froze. Finally, they climbed from the bed and crept into the living room. Just as they entered and switched on the light, the piano stopped. There was no one there. They stood, their arms wrapped around each other for several minutes. Upon returning to the bedroom, they were just about to climb back into bed when they noticed the book was gone. Slowly, they made their way upstairs to the tiny room. The door to that room, which had sat for weeks in the hallway stripped of its hinges, had been replaced. The locks were bolted tight. They never saw the book nor attempted to enter the room again. A short time later, they broke their lease and moved to another house in Traverse City, a house which was carefully inspected for locked doors. The small two-story house in Braun still stands, and doubtless is occupied even tonight. One wonders if the secret of that small dark room and that shelf of books will ever be known. Or will it forever be part of the haunting of Northwest Michigan?
M123 is a lightly traveled stretch of road that runs between Moran and Whitefish Point in Michigan's Upper Peninsula. Passing through the towns of Trout Lake, Eckerman, and Paradise, the highway exposes the motorist to a wide range of remote, rugged, and strikingly beautiful landscapes. It was just the kind of place C.J. Tasker loved. Born in Detroit, Tasker was a student at Northern Michigan University in the early 1960s. On weekends, his favorite pastime was exploring the back roads of Michigan's beautiful North Country. On a gray and foggy weekend in October 1963, Tasker was driving along M123 early on a Saturday morning. He was a few miles north of Paradise, hugging the shoreline of Whitefish Bay. While sipping coffee from his thermos, from the corner of his eye he spotted a place where the grass along the road grew in a telltale pattern. The growth suggested there had once been a road here.
Tasker slowed his military surplus Jeep, turned around, and returned to the overgrown two-track leading into a thick stand of pines. No one had been down this road in a long time. His heart started beating fast with the excitement of discovery. The first quarter mile, the path was nearly impassable as long, intertwined branches of the trees brushed across and over his vehicle. Then the two-track opened and became smoother. Tasker drove another half-mile, noticing that the fog was getting thicker. The mid-morning sun was just a hazy circle in the sky. He switched on his headlights, fearful that he might suddenly find himself driving straight into the cold waters of Whitefish Bay. Suddenly, through the haze on both sides, Tasker detected shapes. Buildings. The two-track had become a wide street. He shut off his engine and stepped from the vehicle. He was in the middle of a town. Tasker grabbed his county plat map and tried to pinpoint his position. After a few quick calculations, his finger traced to a point on the map where absolutely nothing appeared. He shook his head and looked around. "Hello," he said, stepping from his Jeep, his voice echoing off the buildings. There were several storefronts, a dozen or more houses, neatly lining the street. The dilapidated state of many of the buildings suggested years of neglect. Tasker climbed the rickety steps of a store that bore the name Sancho Dry Goods. He cupped his hands over his eyes and peered inside. The shelves were empty, but a very old cash register still stood near the front. Next to it, a broom rested, as if someone had swept the floor that very morning. The rest of the buildings were equally deserted. Many of the homes still had furniture inside, but little else. As he emerged near the far end of the street, Tasker spotted a small brick building. Over the door, a stone block was engraved, U.S. Post Office, Sheldrake, Michigan. Tasker turned to go back to his Jeep, but the fog had thickened so much he could not see it. Stumbling blindly, he navigated from memory until the familiar shape of his vehicle swam from the fog. He climbed inside and returned to his county plat map. He searched and searched, but there was nothing on the highly detailed map to indicate a town named Sheldrake. Suddenly, he jumped. His peripheral vision picked up a shape moving in the fog near his door, then another on the passenger side. He strained his eyes, peering through the drizzle on the windshield. There was movement, but just what he could not tell. Tasker's heart was pounding. He reached for the ignition key on the dashboard. He was ready to get out of Sheldrake fast. But the key was gone. More dark shapes moved around outside his vehicle. Tasker frantically ran his hands along the floorboards of the Jeep, searching for the key. It wasn't there. He sat up straight, considering the canvas top of the Jeep, which would offer no protection at all. Dark shapes darted back and forth outside. His eyes were wide as saucers as his mind raced with what to do next. Tasker took a deep breath and tried to calm himself. Maybe these were just hikers or hunters or something. Maybe he just dropped his key right outside the door. His hand shaking, Tasker reached for the headlight switch and pulled. Three days later, a state trooper traveling along M123 noticed a small green Jeep on the shoulder of the road. A county plat map was open on the passenger seat. A half-filled thermos of cold coffee lay on the floor. The key was in the ignition. C.J. Tasker was never seen again. The Haunting of Northwest Michigan.
In the late 1940s, citizens of Manistee who wanted to travel had three options. If they were lucky enough to own a car, they could drive. If they wanted comfort and reliability, the town was connected by train to Saginaw, and from there to anywhere in the contiguous United States. The third means of travel was by bus. For a brief time in 1948, an ambitious upstart company called Aurora Lines ran 3 daily buses between Manistee and Grand Rapids. 1 bus in the morning, 1 in the afternoon, and a red-eye late at night. Aurora Lines only lasted about 1 year. The company's owners had overestimated the demand for such a route. The buses were rarely more than half full, and the company had a difficult time keeping drivers for the lonely overnight trip on M37. Charles Desmond thinks he knows why. He drove the red-eye bus. In the fall of '48, business had been picking up. Charles had several regular passengers who he came to know by name, and a number of hunters had started taking the bus north to their camps for deer season. Because hunting camps were rarely near towns, the bus line installed a push button on each row of seats. If a passenger wished to get off the bus between stops, they just needed to push the button, which would sound a buzzer near the driver, who would pull over to let them off. On November 10th, Charles had 6 passengers on board. At Kent City, 2 more boarded, followed by 3 hunters in Newaygo, bound for their camp north of Wolf Lake. Most nights, Charlie kept a few interior lights on so he could see his passengers and they could see him. As he looked in the large mirror above him, out of habit, he counted the passengers. 12. He counted them again. There should be 11, but there were 12. At the stop in White Cloud, Charlie did a ticket check. Each passenger produced a ticket. Charlie checked them against his manifest. There were 11 tickets. There were 11 passengers on the manifest. He counted the passengers on the bus again. 12. Figuring he was simply overtired, Charlie dismissed the count, got back behind the wheel, and started driving again. A few miles north of Baldwin, the buzzer sounded next to his seat. He slowed the bus and pulled off the road. The 3 hunters bound for Wolf Lake came forward out of the darkness. Charlie punched their tickets. They stepped from the bus and walked off into the night. A little over an hour later, on M55, one of Charlie's regular passengers came forward and tapped him on the shoulder. "Do you smell something?" Charlie sniffed the air. He did. A sweet aroma. It reminded him of maple sap being boiled down to make syrup. "Yeah, I do," he told the passenger. "What is that?" "I don't know, but it's making me sick," said the man. "How far to Manistee?" "Oh, 5-10 minutes," said Charlie. Just then another familiar face came forward. A woman from Onekama who rode the bus once a month. "Charlie, that smell, it gives me the creeps," the woman said. "Why is that?" Charlie smiled up to her in the big mirror. "My uncle used to be a mortician," the lady said. "His hands always had that smell. I think it's embalming fluid." "Oh, come on," said the other man. "This is a bus, not a hearse." But a shiver shot down Charlie's neck. He switched on a couple of interior lights, grabbed his passenger list from the clipboard, and asked the woman to count how many passengers were on the list, not including the 3 hunters he had crossed off. 8, she counted. "Now how many passengers are on the bus?" he asked. 9. Charlie asked the man to count next. The result was the same. 8 passengers on the list, 9 on the bus. "What's going on? You have a stowaway or something?" "I'm not sure," said Charlie. We're almost into Manistee. We'll sort it out then. Minutes later, he pulled into the bus station and switched on all the interior lights. Charlie pinched himself on the arm to make sure he was wide awake and alert. After opening the luggage compartments, he stationed himself next to the bus door and carefully counted each passenger as they got off. After 8 had left, there were no more. He stepped back inside the brightly lit bus. It was empty. Charlie looked all around the bus, but there was no one. He checked the emergency door. It was locked tight. He got down on his hands and knees and peered under the seats, but there was no one on the bus. He returned to his driver's seat and poured a cup of coffee from his thermos. Oh well, if it was a stowaway, he thought, he slipped away as quietly as he sneaked on. The Manistee bus station was empty, and he had to get back. He started the bus, took another quick look around, switched off the interior lights, and headed back toward Grand Rapids. Just a little south of Baldwin, in the blackness of an autumn night in rural West Michigan, the smell returned. Sweet, acidic, slightly chemical. Charlie was frozen in his seat. His hands grew clammy and tightened around the steering wheel. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He peered into the mirror above his head and saw nothing but blackness. Then someone pushed one of the buttons on the seats behind him, and the buzzer sounded. Someone wanted off the bus. Charlie let off the gas, applied the brake, and pulled the bus to the side of the road. Someone wanted off the bus, all right. He did. He flung open the door and, without looking back, took off at full speed, running down the middle of M37. He never looked back or slowed down. He ran until the sun came up, then hitchhiked to Chicago, where his sister lived. He never called the bus company to explain. Some police officers came to his sister's house asking about him, but she told them she hadn't seen Charlie. He remembers reading that Aurora Bus Lines went out of business 2 months later. He still has no idea who was with him on that bus, and he does not want to know. The haunting of Northwest Michigan. Raised in a military family, Ellie was not a person who stood still for very long. She was used to moving around, seeing the world, and spending very little time at home. Ellie and her husband especially enjoyed spontaneous weekend getaways, where they often had no idea where they were going until they got there. In 1975, Ellie and Joe moved to a small house near Norwood, about a mile from the Lake Michigan shore. Since she was home so little, she decided to invest in an answering machine to catch the calls they were missing. It recorded the messages on small cassette tapes, each of which held about 5 minutes worth of messages. Starting in July, Ellie and Joe spent almost every weekend exploring northern Michigan. They would depart on Friday afternoons and most often return home on Sunday evening. They had made a number of friends in the area, so their answering machine often had a dozen or more messages waiting. The third weekend in July, there was another message. It lasted just over 20 seconds and came at the very end of the tape. There was no voice, just a low-level hissing noise, as though the call was coming from a long distance. There were a few clicks on the line, and Ellie believed she could hear a television in the background. Ellie and Joe didn't think much of the strange message, but the next Sunday night, when they returned home from a jaunt to Marquette, the machine had another similar message. The same distant line noise, the same sound of a television in the background, and this time, a voice. 15 seconds into the message, the soft voice of an elderly woman said, "Oh, gracious." There was a click, and the message ended. This time, something about the message bothered Ellie. The person calling obviously was quite old, and perhaps didn't understand how answering machines worked. There was also something familiar about the voice, but she couldn't quite place it. 2 days later, Ellie drove to Charlevoix to purchase groceries, and when she returned, the first thing she noticed was the blinking answering machine. This time, the message lasted almost a full minute. The background sounds were the same, and Ellie could hear a muffled noise as though the caller was covering the mouthpiece. Just before the message ended, the same woman's voice said, "Can you call? I'm so lonesome here." Now Ellie was worried. She feared that perhaps a confused elderly person was calling a wrong number, trying to reach a relative. Perhaps that person even needed help. She called the phone company, but this was long before the days of computerized switching and caller ID. They could not trace a call without a court order. For the next 2 weeks, Ellie stayed close to home and dashed every time the phone rang, hoping to catch a call from the old woman. She didn't call back until the following Sunday, when Ellie and Joe were in church. When Ellie listened to the message on the answering machine, her skin turned to gooseflesh, and the hair on the back of her neck stood up. This time, the old woman called her by name. You are about to hear the message from Ellie's answering machine, recorded over 30 years ago.
Has anyone tried to reach you, Elsie? I just wait here and nobody calls. Please try to find out what I'm supposed to do.
This was the longest message Ellie had received, and it shocked her to her core. She recognized the voice. It was her Aunt Marie on her mother's side. When Ellie had lived with her parents at the naval base in San Diego in the 1940s, Aunt Marie had been her babysitter. She was the only person who had ever called her by her real name, Elsie. She hadn't seen or spoken to Marie for decades. Ellie immediately rifled through her address books, trying desperately to find a phone number for Aunt Marie, but there was none. She then remembered Marie had a son named Thomas. She called San Diego Information, and luckily he still lived there. She called Tom, and after several minutes was able to help him remember who she was. Then she said, "Is your mother all right? She's been leaving these odd messages on my answering machine for weeks, and she sounds scared." Tom was silent for a long moment. "Ellie, Mom passed away on the 20th of July. After hanging up the phone a few minutes later, Ellie asked her husband if he could remember what date they had received the first message. He looked at the calendar. "Let's see," he said. "That was the weekend we went to Mackinac, so it would have been Sunday the 20th. The Haunting of Northwest Michigan.
Thanks for joining us on this Halloween night for The Haunting of Northwest Michigan, brought to you tonight in its entirety by the outstanding crew at Williams Body Shop, part of the Williams Auto Group on US 31 South, next to the Grand Traverse Mall. Until next year,